"Ma'am, either leave the bank right now, or I'll have security escort you out." The words cracked through the lobby so sharply that even the soft piano music playing overhead seemed to disappear. For a moment the entire room froze. A woman halfway through signing a deposit slip stopped moving. A man in a navy business suit lowered his coffee cup. The rhythmic clicking of keyboards behind the teller counters slowed into silence. Naomi Brooks stood alone in the center of the marble-floored lobby, one hand resting on the strap of her worn leather bag. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at the bank manager standing across from her and took a slow breath. Morning sunlight streamed through the 40-foot glass windows facing Main Street, casting long reflections across the polished floor. The building smelled faintly of fresh coffee, printer toner, and lemon-scented cleaning solution. It was the kind of place designed to make people feel small if they didn't belong. Richard Coleman knew that. He had managed the branch for nearly 15 years. He knew exactly how power felt in a room. And right now he believed he had all of it. "You heard me," Richard said, adjusting the cuff of his expensive gray jacket. "This area is reserved for clients with scheduled appointments." Naomi's expression never changed. "I do have business here." Richard let out a short laugh. Not loud, not friendly, just enough for nearby customers to hear. "Then I suggest you conduct it at one of the public service counters." A few people exchanged glances. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to become part of the scene unfolding in front of them. Naomi shifted her gaze toward the reception desk where a digital display listed the day's appointments. Then she looked back at Richard. "I'm here regarding a financial trust file," she said calmly. "The matter is time-sensitive." Richard folded his arms. "And I'm telling you that without an appointment, there's nothing I can do." Behind him, several employees pretended to focus on their computer screens while secretly listening. Naomi could feel every pair of eyes in the room measuring her. Her simple brown coat, her comfortable walking shoes, the faint wear on the edges of her handbag. The assumptions arrived before questions ever did. They always did. Outside, traffic rolled past the building. A city bus hissed to a stop at the curb. The distant sound of a siren echoed somewhere downtown. Inside the bank, however, everything felt trapped in stillness. Richard stepped closer. "Look, ma'am," he said. "We have procedures." Naomi nodded once. "I understand procedures." Something about her answer irritated him. Maybe it was the confidence. Maybe it was the lack of embarrassment. Most people back down when challenged publicly. Most people apologized. Naomi did neither. Instead, her eyes drifted briefly toward a stack of documents sitting on a side desk near the private offices. Just a glance. Barely noticeable. But something there caught her attention. A single page sat slightly out of alignment with the others. A number. A name. A detail. Her gaze lingered for less than a second before returning to Richard. "I only need a few minutes," she said. Richard shook his head. "You need to leave." The room seemed to tighten around the words. Naomi remained perfectly still. Then, as another customer quietly stepped aside to watch, her attention shifted once more toward the document stack. This time, her brow moved almost imperceptibly. Because what she had just noticed wasn't a minor mistake. It was the kind of mistake that could cost someone millions of dollars. And nobody else in the room appeared to realize it yet. Richard Coleman followed her line of sight and immediately stepped sideways, blocking the view of the document stack. The movement was subtle, but Naomi noticed it. So did a young employee seated near the private offices. The woman looked up from her monitor for a brief second before quickly lowering her eyes again. The silence inside the bank stretched uncomfortably. Naomi could almost hear the hum of the overhead lights reflecting off the polished marble floor. Somewhere near the entrance, the automatic doors opened and closed with a soft mechanical sigh as new customers stepped inside, only to slow down when they sensed tension in the room. Richard straightened his jacket. "This conversation is over." Naomi remained calm. "I understand." His eyebrows lifted slightly, surprised by the lack of resistance. "Good." She adjusted the strap of her bag and glanced once more toward the documents. "Before I leave, there is something you should check." Richard exhaled sharply through his nose. "I am not interested in advice." Naomi nodded. "That is your choice." The answer irritated him even more. There was something about her composure that felt impossible to control. Most people became defensive when embarrassed in public. Most people tried to explain themselves. Naomi simply stood there as though she had nothing to prove. A few feet away, an elderly man waiting for assistance quietly folded his newspaper and continued watching. At the teller stations, conversations had nearly stopped. Employees pretended to work while listening carefully. Richard noticed it too. The attention. The audience. And that only made him more determined to end the situation quickly. "Security will escort you out if necessary," he said. Naomi's eyes settled on his for a moment. "I am not causing a disturbance. You are interfering with bank operations." By speaking. The question landed softly, but several people exchanged glances. Richard felt heat creeping into his face. By refusing to leave. Naomi looked toward the front entrance. "I was actually about to leave." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his expression. Then Naomi added, "I only wanted to warn someone." Richard folded his arms tighter. "Warn us about what?" Naomi hesitated. Not because she lacked confidence. Because she was deciding whether it was worth saying. Through the glass walls of the bank, sunlight reflected off passing cars and storefront windows. Downtown traffic continued moving as if nothing unusual was happening. Inside, however, every eye seemed fixed on her. Finally she spoke. "There is a file on that desk." Richard's jaw tightened immediately. "You should not be looking at private documents." "I was not trying to." "Then stop talking about them." Naomi glanced toward the stack again. The transfer authorization attached to the top file does not match the client reference code listed on the supporting paperwork. The room went completely still. Even Richard blinked. For half a second. Then he laughed. Not because it was funny. Because dismissing her felt easier than considering the possibility she might be right. "You expect me to believe you noticed that from across the room?" Naomi answered honestly. "Yes." A faint smile appeared on the face of the young employee near the offices before she quickly looked away. Richard saw it and his expression darkened. "You do not work here." "No, you have no access to those files." "No. You have no idea what you are talking about." Naomi studied him carefully. "I hope that is true." Those 6 words landed far heavier than he expected. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a sudden voice came from behind the private office door. "Richard." The bank manager turned immediately. The voice belonged to one of the senior operations supervisors. The woman stepped into the lobby holding a folder against her chest. Her expression looked unusually tense. And the moment Naomi saw the folder in her hands, her stomach sank. It was the same file. Richard's confident posture faded the moment he saw the operations supervisor standing in the doorway. Her name was Karen Whitmore, and she was not the kind of employee who interrupted a branch manager in the middle of a public dispute. The folder pressed against her chest looked heavier than paper should have. "Richard, I need a word," she said quietly. The tension in her voice immediately caught the attention of several employees. Richard forced a smile. "Can it wait?" Karen glanced around the lobby before lowering her voice. No, for the first time that morning, uncertainty crept into the room. Naomi watched without speaking. The folder in Karen's hands was unmistakable. The cream-colored cover. The blue authorization tab. The placement of the supporting documents. It was the same file she had noticed from across the room. Richard stepped toward Karen and reached for the folder. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before handing it over. That hesitation did not go unnoticed. Neither did the way her eyes briefly flickered toward Naomi. Richard opened the folder. The smile disappeared from his face. Several pages rustled beneath his fingers. He flipped through them quickly, then more slowly. The color drained from his expression. "Where did this come from?" he asked. Karen folded her arms. "That is what I was about to ask you." The lobby remained silent except for the distant hum of the air conditioning system. A customer near the entrance quietly lowered his phone. An elderly woman waiting in line removed her reading glasses and watched. Richard turned another page. Then another. Naomi recognized the sequence immediately. Transfer request. Authorization sheet. Compliance review. Supporting account documentation. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Richard looked up sharply. Who reviewed this? Karen shook her head. That is the problem. The signatures do not match the review log. A murmur spread among the employees. Richard closed the folder. Take this to my office. Karen did not move. The transaction is scheduled for processing in less than an hour. Those words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Naomi felt a familiar weight settle in her chest. She had seen situations like this before. Not recently. Not for years. But enough times to recognize the warning signs. The young employee near the private offices finally spoke. Sir. Everyone turned. Her voice sounded nervous. The client reference number on that file does not match the account listed in the transfer request. Richard stared at her. What? The employee swallowed hard. I checked after the customer mentioned it. Her eyes shifted briefly toward Naomi. The room froze again. Richard slowly turned toward Naomi. For several seconds neither spoke. The sunlight pouring through the glass windows suddenly felt colder. Outside, people walked along Main Street carrying coffee cups and shopping bags, completely unaware of what was unfolding inside the bank. Richard's jaw tightened. How did you know? Naomi looked at the folder, then at him. Because numbers tell stories, she said quietly. And that one was telling the wrong story. No one laughed this time. No one rolled their eyes. The confidence that had filled the room earlier had begun to crack. And as Richard stared at the woman he had been trying to remove from the building only minutes earlier, a troubling realization began forming in the back of his mind. Maybe the biggest problem in the bank was not standing in front of him. Maybe it was already inside the file. The air inside the bank felt different now. The confidence that had filled the lobby only minutes earlier had been replaced by uncertainty. Richard Coleman stood motionless, the folder still in his hands. He flipped through the pages again, slower this time. Every turn of a page seemed to deepen the line forming between his eyebrows. Karen Whitmore remained beside him, waiting. She had worked in banking long enough to recognize the look of a problem growing larger by the minute. Naomi Brooks quietly adjusted the strap of her bag and said nothing. She was no longer trying to convince anyone. The documents were doing that on their own. Across the room, customers who had originally been watching out of curiosity now watched with concern. The young employee near the private offices stared at her monitor, comparing numbers from the file against information displayed on the screen. Her fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. The soft clicking echoed through the silence. Then she stopped. Her eyes widened. Sir, she said carefully. Richard looked up. What now? She swallowed. The destination account was modified yesterday evening. Karen frowned immediately. Modified by who? The employee shook her head. I do not know yet. Richard walked toward her station. The polished leather soles of his shoes tapped against the marble floor. He leaned over her shoulder and studied the screen. Naomi could see tension settling into his posture. The man who had seemed completely certain of everything an hour ago now looked like someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Karen stepped closer. Can we trace the authorization? The employee nodded slowly. Maybe. Richard rubbed his temple. Maybe is not good enough. Naomi glanced toward the large windows facing Main Street. Sunlight reflected off passing vehicles and storefront signs. People outside continued their day without realizing that a financial mistake potentially worth millions of dollars was unfolding just feet away. Her attention returned to the screen. Something still bothered her. Not the altered account number. Something else. Something hidden beneath it. Karen noticed Naomi watching. For a brief moment their eyes met. Unlike Richard, Karen did not look annoyed. She looked curious. You said the numbers were telling the wrong story, Karen said. Naomi nodded. Yes. Richard looked up immediately. What does that even mean? Naomi took a slow breath. People focus on the account number because it is obvious. She pointed toward the folder. But the transfer timing is stranger. Richard frowned. Stranger how? The transaction was scheduled for processing during a period when the trust account normally restricts large movements. Karen's expression changed. You noticed that too? Naomi nodded. Richard looked from one woman to the other. Wait, there are restrictions. Karen answered before Naomi could. There are supposed to be. The room grew quiet again. Richard slowly turned back toward the file. Every answer seemed to create two new questions. The young employee clicked through several more screens. Then she froze. Sir. Richard looked up. What? Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. Someone disabled the restriction settings 3 days ago. No one spoke. Even the distant sound of phones ringing behind the service desk seemed to fade. Richard stared at the screen. Karen stared at the screen. Naomi stared at the screen. Because all three of them understood the same thing at the same moment. This was no longer a simple paperwork mistake. And somewhere inside the bank, someone knew exactly what they were doing. The words lingered over the lobby like a storm cloud nobody could ignore. Someone disabled the restriction settings 3 days ago. Richard Coleman stared at the monitor as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something less troubling. They did not. The screen remained unchanged. The transaction remained scheduled. The altered account remained active. And somewhere behind all of it was a decision that should never have happened. Karen Whitmore slowly exhaled. Lock the transfer. The young employee hesitated. I do not have authorization. Richard finally found his voice. Then use mine. His answer came too quickly. Too sharply. Several employees looked up. Karen watched him carefully but said nothing. The employee immediately began typing. The soft clicks of the keyboard echoed across the lobby. Naomi stood quietly near the reception desk. She could feel the atmosphere shifting. Earlier, she had been the problem everyone wanted removed. Now nobody seemed interested in asking her to leave. Richard turned toward her. How did you notice all of this? Naomi looked at the marble floor for a moment before answering. Years ago, I worked around trust management documents. Richard frowned. Worked around them? Something like that. It was not a complete answer, but she offered nothing more. Karen stepped closer. You recognize the timing restriction. Naomi nodded. And the authorization sequence. Karen crossed her arms. Most people would not catch that. Naomi gave a small shrug. Most people were not looking for it. The honesty of the statement seemed to unsettle Richard. He looked away. Across the room, customers continued watching openly now. The tension had become impossible to ignore. A teller stopped counting cash midway through a stack of bills. A loan officer remained frozen beside a printer that had finished its job almost a minute earlier. Then a notification appeared on the employee's monitor. A sharp electronic chime broke the silence. Everyone turned. The young employee's eyes widened. Sir. Richard immediately stepped forward. What is it? She swallowed. The transfer lock request was denied. Nobody spoke. Karen blinked. Denied. The system says the authorization was overridden by a higher clearance level. Richard's expression hardened. That is not possible. Apparently it is. Karen leaned closer to the monitor. The color drained slightly from her face. Naomi noticed immediately. What? Richard asked. Karen pointed toward the screen. Look at the approval code. Richard stared. For a second, confusion flashed across his features. Then concern. Replaced it. The code belonged to regional oversight. Not the branch. Not local management. Someone above them had approved the change. A cold silence settled over the lobby. Outside, sunlight reflected off the glass windows in bright flashes as traffic moved along Main Street. Inside, however, the room suddenly felt smaller. Richard loosened his tie slightly. For the first time that morning, he looked genuinely nervous. Karen folded the folder against her chest. We need to contact regional compliance. Richard nodded. Immediately. Naomi's eyes drifted toward the file once more. Something still felt incomplete. The numbers explained the transfer. The override explained the restriction removal. But neither explained the original trust account. Her gaze moved to the client name printed near the top page. The moment she saw it clearly, her heartbeat slowed. Then stopped. Not literally, but enough to make her stand perfectly still. Because she recognized the name. And if she was right, the account at the center of the entire situation should never have been touched in the first place. Naomi Brooks kept her eyes on the name printed at the top of the trust file. Around her, conversations had vanished completely. Even the customers seemed to sense that something important was unfolding. Richard Coleman was already on the phone with regional compliance, pacing slowly across the polished floor near the private offices. Karen Whitmore stood beside the young employee's workstation, reviewing screen after screen of authorization logs. The glow from the monitors reflected across their faces. Naomi barely noticed any of it. Her attention remained fixed on the file. She had seen that trust name before. Not recently. Years ago. Long before she had returned to the city. Long before she had stepped into this branch that morning. A memory surfaced quietly. A conference room overlooking Lake Michigan. Thick financial reports spread across a polished table. Her grandfather's voice explaining why certain trusts existed not merely to hold wealth, but to protect legacies, protect communities, protect generations. Naomi blinked and returned to the present. The account listed in the file belonged to one of the oldest protected trusts in the region. Every significant transaction required layers of review, multiple signatures, independent verification. Nothing about the transfer request made sense. Karen noticed the change in Naomi's expression. You recognize the account, do not you? Naomi hesitated. I recognize the structure. Karen studied her carefully. What does that mean? Before Naomi could answer, Richard ended his call. The look on his face told everyone the conversation had not gone well. Regional compliance says the override is legitimate. Silence followed. Karen stared at him. Legitimate. Richard nodded. That is what they claim. The young employee looked confused. Then why are the authorization records incomplete? Richard had no answer. He rubbed his forehead and looked exhausted despite the fact that it was not yet noon. The bank lobby felt strangely smaller now. The sunlight that had seemed bright earlier was beginning to soften as thin clouds drifted across the sky outside. Naomi finally spoke. Who approved the override? Richard looked at her for a moment, then at the file, then back at her. The approval came from someone in executive operations. Karen's eyebrows lifted. Executive operations never handles transfers like this directly. Richard nodded. I know. The words hung in the air. Naomi looked toward the monitor again. Something suddenly connected in her mind. A detail she had ignored earlier. Can I see the timestamp? She asked. Richard frowned. Why? Please. The young employee rotated the monitor slightly. Naomi leaned forward. Her eyes moved across the transaction history. Then she froze. There it was. A small detail buried among dozens of routine entries. Easy to miss. Easy to dismiss. But impossible to ignore once seen. The override happened at 2:17 in the morning, she said quietly. Karen looked confused. So, Naomi straightened slowly. Executive operations closes at 7 in the evening. Nobody spoke. Richard's face changed immediately. Karen looked back at the screen, then at the file, then back at the screen again. The realization spread across the room one person at a time. The authorization was entered after hours, then somebody had accessed a protected system when they should not have. The young employee swallowed hard. You mean someone used executive credentials? Naomi nodded. Richard stared at the monitor. For several seconds he seemed unable to speak. Then a new notification appeared on the screen. A red banner flashed across the top of the transaction dashboard. Every employee nearby turned toward it. The transfer status had changed. Scheduled processing had become active processing. Despite every warning, despite every question, despite every attempt to stop it, the money had just started moving. The red banner seemed to glow brighter with every passing second. Active processing. The words sat at the top of the monitor like a countdown nobody could stop. Richard Coleman moved first. Freeze it. His voice cut through the silence. The young employee immediately began typing again, her fingers moving so quickly that several keystrokes blended together. Karen Whitmore stepped beside her and watched the screen. Come on, she whispered. Naomi remained still. Her eyes followed the transaction data as new entries appeared one after another. The money was moving through a chain of intermediary accounts. Fast. Deliberately fast. Whoever designed the transfer understood exactly how to make recovery difficult. The employee suddenly stopped typing. It is not responding. Richard leaned forward. What do you mean it is not responding? The freeze request is pending. Karen frowned. Pending approval? The employee nodded slowly. It requires executive authorization. Richard let out a breath and immediately reached for his phone again. Across the lobby, customers had abandoned any attempt to hide their curiosity. The atmosphere no longer felt like a normal banking day. It felt like everyone had become unwilling witnesses to something larger than themselves. Naomi looked toward the glass windows. Clouds had begun gathering overhead, softening the sunlight that spilled across the marble floor. The bright reflections from earlier were fading. Everything seemed quieter now. Even the city outside felt distant. Richard paced while waiting for someone to answer. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Finally someone picked up. This is Richard Coleman. I need executive authorization immediately. He listened. Then his expression changed. What do you mean nobody is available? Karen looked up sharply. Richard turned away from the room. This transfer is active right now. More silence from the other end. Then Richard lowered the phone slowly. They said the executive office is in an emergency review session. Karen blinked. Now. Richard nodded. And they are refusing interruptions. Naomi felt a small chill move through her chest. Emergency review session. The timing was too convenient. The young employee suddenly pointed at the monitor. Another account just appeared. Everyone moved closer. A second destination account had been added to the transaction chain. Then a third. Karen stared at the screen. They are splitting the transfer. Naomi nodded. Layering. Richard looked at her. What? Breaking large transfers into smaller movements through multiple accounts. Karen's eyes widened. To make tracing harder. Naomi said nothing. She simply watched the numbers continue shifting. Then something unexpected happened. A new name appeared among the transaction details. Not a destination account. Not an approval code. A notification recipient. Karen read it aloud. Brooks Family Trust Oversight. The words seemed to stop time. Richard looked confused. The employee looked confused. Several customers nearby exchanged puzzled glances. But Naomi's face became completely still. Karen slowly turned toward her. You know that name. It was not a question. Naomi looked at the monitor for several seconds before answering. Yes. Richard stared. How? Naomi folded her hands around the strap of her bag. The lobby felt impossibly quiet. Because that trust was established by my grandfather. No one spoke. The air seemed to leave the room all at once. Richard's face lost color. Karen's eyes widened. The young employee froze with her hands resting above the keyboard. And for the first time that day, every person in the bank realized they had never actually known who Naomi Brooks was. For several long seconds nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound came from the faint hum of computers and the distant rush of traffic beyond the glass walls. Richard Coleman stared at Naomi Brooks as if he were seeing her for the first time. The woman he had dismissed. The woman he had nearly ordered out of the building. The woman who now stood quietly in the center of a crisis connected directly to one of the most protected financial trusts in the region. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the monitor again. The numbers continued changing. The transfer was still active. Money was still moving. Why did you not say something earlier? Richard finally asked. His voice sounded smaller than before. Naomi looked at him calmly. Would you have listened? The question landed softly, but nobody had an answer. Karen Whitmore glanced away. The young employee focused on her keyboard. Even Richard remained silent, because they all knew the truth. Earlier that morning, nobody had wanted to hear what Naomi had to say. Karen stepped closer. If your grandfather established the trust, then you understand its oversight structure. Naomi nodded once. Better than most people. Can you help us stop this? Naomi looked at the screen. The transaction chain had expanded again. More accounts. More routing paths. Whoever built the transfer had anticipated resistance. Every layer made intervention more difficult. She took a slow breath. Maybe. Richard immediately leaned forward. Maybe is better than nothing. Naomi studied the data for several moments. Then she pointed toward a section of the transaction log. There. Karen followed her finger. What am I looking at? The notification sequence. The young employee adjusted the display. Naomi continued. The transfer is not completely independent. It is still waiting for one final verification checkpoint. Richard frowned. I thought it was already processing. It is, Naomi said. But certain legacy trust structures require a secondary validation event before final settlement. Karen's eyes widened. A safeguard. Naomi nodded. Exactly. Hope appeared in the room for the first time in nearly an hour. Richard looked at the screen. Can we use it? Naomi hesitated. Only if we can reach the oversight authority before the checkpoint closes. The young employee clicked through another menu. How long do we have? Naomi watched the countdown timer, hidden within the processing dashboard. Her expression grew serious. 22 minutes. The number settled over the room like a weight. 22 minutes. Not an hour. Not a day. 22 minutes to stop millions of dollars from disappearing through a network of accounts. Richard immediately grabbed his phone. Karen began gathering documents. Employees moved faster. The atmosphere transformed from confusion into urgency. Yet Naomi remained still. Something continued bothering her. The transfer itself was sophisticated. The authorization override was sophisticated. The timing was sophisticated. But one detail still felt wrong. Her eyes drifted back to the approval record. Then she saw it. A tiny notation buried beneath several system entries. Easy to overlook. Almost invisible. Naomi's heartbeat quickened. Karen noticed immediately. What is it? Naomi stared at the screen. I know that authorization code. Richard stopped moving. What do you mean? Naomi slowly lifted her eyes. The color had drained from her face. It belongs to someone who should not be involved in this transaction. The room went silent again. Richard swallowed. Who? Naomi did not answer immediately. Outside, dark clouds rolled across the afternoon sky. The sunlight faded behind them. Inside the bank, every eye remained fixed on her. Finally she spoke. A member of my own family. The words settled over the room with almost physical weight. A member of my own family. Nobody knew how to respond. Richard Coleman lowered his phone slowly. Karen Whitmore stared at Naomi, searching her face for some sign that she had misspoken. The young employee sat frozen in front of the monitor, her hands resting above the keyboard. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the towering glass windows. The sound was faint, steady, almost rhythmic. Naomi looked back at the transaction log. The authorization code belongs to my cousin, Victor Brooks. Karen exchanged a glance with Richard. He has oversight. Authority. Naomi nodded once. Limited authority. Not enough for something like this. Richard frowned. Then how is his code attached to the transfer? Naomi did not answer immediately. She was asking herself the same question. Victor had always been ambitious, intelligent, careful. But this did not feel like him. It felt bigger, more deliberate. The countdown timer continued decreasing in the corner of the screen. 19 minutes. 18 minutes. 17. Every second seemed louder than the last. Richard finally broke the silence. Can you contact him? Naomi reached into her bag and removed her phone. The screen reflected in her eyes as she searched for his number. Around her, the bank remained eerily quiet. Even customers waiting for service had stopped pretending they were not listening. Naomi pressed call. 1 ring. 2 rings. 3. Then voicemail. She ended the call and immediately tried again. Same result. Karen folded her arms. Maybe he is in a meeting. Naomi shook her head. Victor always answers. That answer worried her more than she wanted to admit. She opened her messages and typed quickly. Call me immediately. Urgent. After sending it, she looked back at the monitor. Another notification appeared. The transfer chain had expanded again. More routing accounts. More complexity. The young employee's face tightened. We are losing visibility. Richard stepped closer. What does that mean? The funds are moving into private holding structures. Karen exhaled slowly. Someone planned this. Naomi felt a familiar feeling settling in her chest. Not fear. Recognition. The realization that every piece of the puzzle was connected. Her eyes moved across the approval logs once more. Then she noticed something she had missed before. A secondary identifier attached to Victor's authorization code. Tiny. Nearly hidden. She leaned closer. Zoom in. The employee enlarged the entry. Naomi's heartbeat quickened. There was another executive credential attached to the override. Not a family name. Not a trust officer. A bank executive. Richard saw it too. That cannot be right. Karen stared at the screen. That is a board-level credential. Nobody spoke. Rain continued sliding down the glass outside. The lobby lights reflected across the wet pavement beyond the windows. Naomi slowly straightened. Suddenly the situation looked very different. Victor might have been involved, or someone had used his access. Either way, he was no longer the center of the mystery. He was only part of it. Richard looked at the countdown timer. 15 minutes remained. Then he looked at Naomi. The confidence and arrogance that had defined him earlier were completely gone. Tell me what to do. The room fell silent again. Earlier that morning, he had wanted her removed from the building. Now he was asking for her help. Naomi looked around the bank. The anxious employees. The worried customers. The rain-darkened sky beyond the glass. Then she focused on the screen one last time. We stop chasing the money, she said quietly. We find the person waiting to receive it. Richard stared at Naomi for a moment, then nodded. Nobody questioned her. Not anymore. The shift was impossible to ignore. Earlier that morning, she had been treated like an inconvenience. Now every person in the room seemed to be waiting for her next sentence. Naomi stepped closer to the monitor. Rain continued sliding down the windows in thin gray lines. The city beyond the glass looked blurred and distant. The countdown timer in the corner of the screen dropped again. 14 minutes. Show me the final routing sequence, she said. The young employee immediately complied. Rows of account numbers appeared across the display. Most looked meaningless. Shell accounts. Temporary holding structures. Intermediary pathways designed to hide the destination. Naomi studied them carefully. Then she pointed to a single entry. That one. Karen leaned forward. Why? Because it does not belong. Richard frowned. None of this belongs. Naomi shook her head. No. This account was inserted later. The employee enlarged the record. A modification timestamp appeared. 8 minutes after the original transfer chain was created. Karen's eyes widened. Someone changed the destination. Naomi nodded. And they did it manually. Richard looked at the account information. Can we identify the owner? The employee typed rapidly. For several seconds nothing happened. Then a profile appeared on the screen. Everyone froze. The account was not offshore. It was not international. It was not hidden behind a corporation. It was local. Very local. Located less than 3 miles from the bank. Karen blinked twice. That cannot be right. Richard stared at the address. It has to be a mistake. Naomi felt her stomach tighten. The destination was not a financial institution. It was a private investment office. One she recognized. Not from trust records. Not from family meetings. From the plaque she had passed countless times while growing up. Brooks Legacy Capital. Silence filled the room. Richard slowly turned toward her. That is your family office. Naomi nodded. It used to be. Used to be. She looked at the rain beyond the windows. My grandfather retired 8 years ago. Leadership changed. Karen folded her arms. To who? Naomi hesitated, then answered quietly. Victor's father. The room fell silent again. Another notification appeared on the screen. This one carried a timestamp from less than 30 seconds earlier. The active transfer had reached its final validation checkpoint. Naomi immediately recognized what it meant. The safeguard was about to trigger. Richard saw her expression change. What is happening? The system is requesting final authorization. Hope flickered across Karen's face. Then we can stop it. Naomi looked at the screen carefully. Maybe. The employee opened the authorization request. A digital signature field appeared. Then everyone noticed the name assigned to approve it. Not Victor Brooks. Not the executive whose credentials had been attached to the override. Naomi Brooks. Nobody spoke. Even the rain seemed quieter. Richard stared at the screen. Karen stared at the screen. The employee's mouth fell slightly open. Naomi herself looked stunned. "Why is my name there?" she whispered. Then understanding arrived all at once. Her grandfather's trust structure. The legacy safeguard. The family oversight authority. He had never removed her access. For years she had assumed it was gone. But now, with millions of dollars hanging in the balance, the system had recognized her as the final gatekeeper. And for the first time that day, Naomi realized she was not standing in the middle of someone else's crisis. She was standing in the middle of her own. Naomi stared at the authorization screen while the countdown continued its relentless march toward 0. 9 minutes remained. The glowing cursor blinked beside her name as though waiting for a decision only she could make. Around her nobody spoke. The rain outside had intensified, streaking the glass in silver lines that distorted the city beyond. Richard Coleman stood motionless a few feet away. Karen Whitmore watched the monitor. The young employee barely seemed to breathe. Naomi could feel the weight of every eye in the room, yet her attention remained fixed on the screen. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. Her grandfather sitting at a long wooden table. His voice calm. His hands folded neatly in front of him. He had always said that wealth was not power. Responsibility was power. Money simply revealed what people chose to do with it. At the time she had been too young to understand. Now she understood perfectly. The cursor continued blinking. Richard finally broke the silence. "Can you stop it?" Naomi looked at the authorization prompt. "Yes." Karen's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Then do it." Naomi did not move. Something still bothered her. The transfer was sophisticated. The routing chain was sophisticated. The credential misuse was sophisticated. Yet whoever designed it had allowed one thing to remain. Her approval authority. That was not a mistake. It felt intentional. Almost as if someone expected her to be here. Expected her to see it. Expected her to intervene. Her phone suddenly vibrated in her hand. Every person nearby looked toward it. Naomi glanced at the screen. A message had arrived. Victor Brooks. Her heart skipped. She opened it immediately. The message contained only 6 words. "Do not approve anything. Trust me." Naomi stared at the text. Richard noticed her expression. "What is it?" She showed him the message. Karen stepped closer. "That is all he sent?" Naomi nodded. A second notification arrived before anyone could speak. This one included a location pin, not an address. A secure conference room inside Brooks' legacy capital. Then another message appeared. "They are watching the transfer. Delay if possible." Naomi read the words twice. Richard looked confused. "What does that mean?" Naomi shook her head. "I do not know." But deep down she suspected Victor was trying to tell her something without saying it directly. The countdown reached 8 minutes. Then 7. Karen folded her arms tightly. "We do not have time for riddles." Naomi knew she was right. She turned back to the authorization screen. The cursor still waited beside her name. Then she noticed something new. A tiny icon had appeared in the corner of the approval window. Most people would never have seen it. A small lock symbol. Legacy verification available. Naomi's eyes widened. Richard immediately noticed. "What?" She pointed at the screen. "There is another option." The young employee quickly opened the menu. A hidden verification pathway appeared beneath the standard approval process. Karen leaned closer. "What is that?" Naomi felt her pulse quicken. She had seen it only once before. Years ago. In her grandfather's office. "It is an audit trigger." Richard frowned. "Meaning?" Naomi looked at the countdown clock. 6 minutes remained. Then she looked back at the hidden option. "If I activate it, every executive credential connected to this transfer becomes visible." Silence filled the room. Suddenly, they were no longer trying to stop anonymous numbers moving through a system. They were about to discover exactly who had been hiding behind them. Naomi looked at the hidden audit option for only a second before pressing it. The reaction was immediate. The approval screen disappeared. New windows opened across the monitor. Lines of encrypted authorization records began unfolding one after another. The young employee stared in disbelief as years of protected oversight data surfaced onto the screen. Karen Whitmore leaned closer. Richard Coleman stopped pacing entirely. Even the customers who remained in the lobby seemed frozen by the tension hanging in the air. Outside, rain continued falling steadily against the glass. Inside, nobody made a sound. The countdown timer kept running. 5 minutes remained. Naomi watched the records load. Then the first executive credential appeared. A regional compliance officer. Then a second. An executive operations director. Then a third. Each name was connected to approval pathways that should never have been linked together. Karen shook her head slowly. This is impossible. Naomi continued reading. The transaction was not the work of one person. It was a chain. A network. Several individuals had quietly approved pieces of the process while avoiding direct responsibility for the whole. Richard stared at the screen. They built layers. Naomi nodded. So nobody would appear responsible. Another record appeared. Then another. Suddenly the loading process stopped. A final authorization entry expanded across the monitor. The room became completely silent. Richard looked first. Then Karen. Then the employee. Nobody spoke. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes. At the very top of the approval hierarchy sat a single name. Charles Brooks. Karen exhaled sharply. Richard looked stunned. Victor's father. Naomi felt a wave of sadness she had not expected. Charles Brooks had spent years managing the family office after her grandfather stepped away. Publicly, he was respected, admired, trusted. Yet the records on the screen were unmistakable. Every critical approval led back to him. Every override. Every exception. Every concealed authorization. The audit trail formed a straight line directly to his office. Her phone vibrated again. Victor Brooks. This time it was a call. Naomi answered immediately. Victor. His voice sounded exhausted. Thank God. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. You knew. Not everything, he admitted. But enough. The room listened quietly. Victor continued. I found evidence 2 days ago. I tried to stop it internally. That is why I sent the warning. Naomi looked back at the screen displaying his father's name. Why did you not tell me? Because I did not know who I could trust. The answer hurt because it sounded true. Victor took a slow breath. Naomi, the transfer was never about the money. Richard frowned. Karen exchanged a glance with him. Naomi remained silent. It was about control, Victor said. If the trust moved, oversight authority would transfer with it. Understanding arrived instantly. The room seemed to shrink around her. The money was only the vehicle. The real objective had been ownership of the family trust structure itself. Naomi looked at the countdown. 4 minutes remained. Victor's voice softened. Granddad never removed your authority. He always believed you would be the one protecting it. Tears did not come. Naomi simply stood there listening to the rain and the quiet hum of the bank. Then she looked at the final audit screen. At the evidence. At the truth. And for the first time all day, she knew exactly what she needed to do. Naomi looked at the countdown clock one final time. 3 minutes remained. The authorization screen waited silently in front of her. Rain continued sliding down the glass walls of the bank, turning the city outside into a blur of gray and silver. Her grandfather's words echoed in her memory. Responsibility is power. Not money. Not titles. Responsibility. Naomi placed her hand on the keyboard. Richard Coleman stood quietly beside her. Karen Whitmore watched the screen. The young employee remained frozen at her station. Nobody spoke. They understood that the next few seconds would determine everything. Naomi selected the hidden audit resolution pathway and entered her credentials. The system requested confirmation. She read every line carefully. Then she pressed approve. Nothing happened at first. The screen remained unchanged. The countdown continued. 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Then suddenly a new notification appeared. Transaction suspended pending executive review. The room exhaled as one. Another notification followed. Then another. Account movement halted. Settlement blocked. Oversight authority restored. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. The transfer had stopped. The money was safe. For a moment nobody moved. The only sound was the soft tapping of rain against the windows. Then Richard lowered his head. Not dramatically. Not for show. Just enough to reveal the weight he had been carrying all morning. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. Naomi looked at him. He continued before she could answer. "When you walked into this bank, I judged you before I knew anything about you. I assumed I knew who belonged here and who did not." The honesty in his voice surprised everyone, including himself. Karen glanced away respectfully. The young employee stared at her desk. Richard met Naomi's eyes. "If you had listened to me and walked out, we would have lost everything." Naomi studied him for a moment. The arrogance she had seen earlier was gone. All that remained was humility. "The problem was never that you did not know who I was," she said softly. "The problem was how you treated me before you did." The words settled over the room in complete silence. Richard nodded slowly. He understood. Outside, the rain began easing. The dark clouds that had covered the city all afternoon started to break apart. Thin shafts of sunlight pushed through the gray sky. Golden reflections spread across the wet sidewalks and the glass towers downtown. Naomi gathered her bag and turned toward the entrance. Nobody stopped her. Nobody questioned her. Customers stepped aside as she walked past. Employees watched quietly. The automatic doors opened with a soft mechanical sigh. Before stepping outside, Naomi paused and looked back once. Richard stood beside Karen, already speaking with investigators and compliance officers who had begun arriving. The young employee was smiling for the first time all day. The bank was safe. The trust was protected. And the truth was finally visible. Naomi stepped into the cool afternoon air. Sunlight touched the rain-soaked pavement, turning ordinary puddles into mirrors of gold. She was not leaving with more money. She was not leaving with a promotion. She was not leaving with revenge. She was leaving with something far rarer: respect. And as she disappeared into the crowd moving along Main Street, the city carried on around her, unaware that one quiet woman had just reminded an entire room that dignity does not come from status, comes from character.